Hey everybody, welcome to Crazy Tech Lab, and I have an absolutely awesome video for you here today because we have a very special motherboard in the lab today, and we have the MSI B650M Project Zero to look at in this video. Super unique motherboard for a very good reason. Don't know if you can see it from there, but can you see any topside connectors on this motherboard? That's right, you probably can't. There are a couple of pins down here. You've obviously got the graphics card connector and the memory slots up here as usual, but there is nothing else. There's no 24-pin ATX connector, there's no fan headers, there's no RGB headers, there's no 8-pin CPU connector. Everything is missing. So is it hidden underneath any of these heatsinks? Well, no, because there's nothing right angled down here or on the underside or at the top. MSI has routed everything to the rear of the PCB. So why would you want to do this, I hear you ask? Well, it means that you don't need to route any cables around to the front of this motherboard, going through your case, through those dreaded cable routing holes and knocking rubber grommets off in the process. Yeah, sure, we've got some great looking cables out there at the moment, but what if you didn't have to deal with any of that? What if you just had to plug things in from the back of your motherboard through the motherboard tray and that was it? You know, just tidy up the cables a bit and that was all you had to do. So that is what the Project Zero is about. It's about zero connectors on the top side of your motherboard. Now, with all these connectors here that you can hopefully see in the video, I'll do some close-up B-roll now so you can get a closer look. What MSI has had to do, and a lot of the more astute of you out there will probably have realized that if you install this against your motherboard tray, all these connectors are just going to be sitting right slap bang up against your motherboard tray and you won't be able to get at them. So what MSI has had to do, and what we actually have here, is the case that MSI has created to cater for this motherboard. Now, the case is called the MSI MAG Pano M100R PZ, standing for Project Zero. So what this is basically a slight rethink of one of MSI's current cases, but it has cutouts in that area for the motherboard and its connectors that kind of face the motherboard tray. So basically all you have to do, and we'll have a look at it in a minute, is just to plug things in from the back and away you go. There's no going through any cable routing holes because you just don't need it. Now, this raises a really interesting concept because I absolutely love this feature, as we'll get to in a minute. I think it's an absolutely killer feature to have with a motherboard and case combo. Just makes cable tidying so much easier. In fact, MSI has basically solved cable tidying for your motherboard here. This is a really easy feature to implement in pretty much any case. Sure, with small fun factor cases, it might be a bit of a challenge, sandwich style, where you've got like a center motherboard tray and motherboard one side, graphics card the other. That might be a bit difficult to implement, but certainly on a standard ATX or micro-ATX tower like this one, all you'd have to do is cut out a series of holes in the motherboard tray to allow the rear connectors on the motherboard to kind of poke through. And that's pretty easy to do if you just kind of set up a standard. There's no reason why every motherboard manufacturer and case manufacturers could actually do that. So a super interesting feature that we've got here with this motherboard today. What we'll be doing is just checking out the other features that you get with this motherboard and installing it into this case to see how everything looks. We'll also be delving into some of the more technical details of the motherboard so we can just check out what you actually get for your money. And then we will also be in a future video looking at the actual cable tidying that you have to do with this case and motherboard combo to see just how easy it is. So we're going to move on now, have a quick walk around of the case and the motherboard with it installed, and we'll come to some conclusions at the end. First though, don't forget to like and comment on this video. It just helps punch me up the algorithm and get me noticed. And I love hearing what you guys think of my videos as well. What do you think of the Project Zero? Would you be interested in a motherboard like this if it had the connectors on the rear? So obviously a bit of an issue if you've already paid for your custom cables, because you probably won't be able to see them, but I think it's a really killer feature. So let me know what you think about it in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel as well. Every subscriber helps keep me going and just gets me noticed, and it means a lot to have your support as well. So don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification icon so you know when I upload a new video, because we've got lots more cool stuff coming your way. So without further ado, let's crack on with the review. So here we are with the Project Zero motherboard then, and as we can see, it's obviously socket AM5, so compatible with Ryzen 7000 series CPUs, including the latest 3D V-Cache ones. And as we can see, there's a huge bank of heatsinks going all the way around the PCB. These two up here, obviously functional, they're cooling the 13-stage power design, and we've got one down here though that isn't actually attached to anything on the underside. It's purely there to hide the solder points for things like the 24-pin ATX connector and a few other gubbins, but that's pretty much the only reason that thing is there. This one cooling a chip underneath the big heatsink there, and down here we do actually have a functional heatsink for the M.2 port, so you've got two thermal pads there for the two PCI Express 4 ports on here. So no PCI Express Gen 5 support for SSDs here, but you do get Gen 4 support, which is probably what I'd recommend you go for anyway. And that's a pretty big heatsink, so that's going to do a decent job of cooling whatever SSDs you have in there, whether you just have one or whether you go with both. So if we have another look at the motherboard, there's not really too much else to say because there aren't any other connectors on the top side of this motherboard, but it does mean that connectivity and the layout is pretty much top notch, because there's virtually nothing to actually connect by way of cables on the top side of the motherboard, so nothing is obscured, nothing's going to be difficult to plug in. You've just got your graphics card to deal with pretty much, as well as your memory and the M.2 ports, of course. So if we flip it over, we'll have a quick look and see what we've actually got, and you can just see here the extent to which MSI has actually routed cables to the rear of the motherboard. So if we start at the top, you've got the two 8-pin EPS 12-volt cables, but you probably only need to connect one of those in most situations. You've got a 3-pin ARGB connector, 3 fan headers. I think in terms of fan headers, you've got, just seeing if there are any others on the motherboard. Yeah, so you've got 3 at the top and 2 more down here, so they're all on the bottom of the motherboard. You also have the 24-pin ATX connector. You've got a Type-C USB port, USB 3. You've got 4 SATA headers. You've got the front panel connector, another RGB connector all down here somewhere, another 3-pin. So it's pretty much everything else. There's very, very little on the top side of the motherboard. So the great thing about this though, and is another reason why this should be easy to implement in other cases, is because everything is just around the edge of the motherboard. So obviously you'd have the difference between a micro-ATX and an ATX design, ATX being a bit longer, but it should be pretty easy to implement nonetheless. So pretty interesting. Something else I forgot to mention on the rear panel is that you do get USB BIOS flashback and you get a clear CMOS button. And BIOS flashback obviously pretty important with AMD motherboards because they tend to have a longer life with Intel compared to Intel CPUs, which means that this motherboard probably won't support the next generation of AMD processors, which are meant to come out later this year. So this will probably need a BIOS update, but BIOS flashback means that you don't need a compatible BIOS for those CPUs to be on your motherboard. You don't even need to have a CPU in the socket to be able to use BIOS flashback. So you can update this motherboard if you get it now, or you buy it on eBay, or buy it at some point in the future and it ends up not being compatible with what we think is going to be AMD Ryzen 8000 series CPUs. This will be compatible with them in the future. So pretty good from a specifications point of view. I love the aesthetic. If I just whack the big heatsink down there back on so you can get a better view of it. I'll just whack in 2 screws for now. Captive screws as well. I love that because I'm forever losing heatsink screws for motherboards, and not just MSI. I was going to say MSI there, but it's kind of all M.2 heatsinks. I've lost a whole bunch of screws over the years. So yeah, it's a pretty good looking motherboard, isn't it? I think it is. I guess maybe it might have been nice to have a black version. I don't think any other colors would have been necessarily a good idea, just because they would make it super niche, but I think black would be my only other recommendation. But I still like silver. I think this would also look pretty cool in a white case as well. So yeah, it's a very, very good looking motherboard, lots of high-end premium features, and of course you have all these crazy ports on the rear that are going to make your cable tidying life a lot easier. So here we have the motherboard installed into the case, and when it comes to actually installing it, there is absolutely nothing extra you need to do to get the motherboard in there. It's literally just everything is the same. Use the same standoffs, same screw mounting points, same screws. The only difference being that you're threading those connectors through the holes in the motherboard tray. So if we just flick things around, we will see what happens when we actually install cables and that kind of stuff. So as you can see up here, just all of these cutouts allow all of the ports to be accessible through the motherboard tray, which is kind of cool. The first issue that I will mention is that this Velcro tie completely covers the Type-C connector on the rear of the motherboard here. So it just kind of looks like this case has been repurposed from MSI's lines to do this. So they've cut out all the connectors, but they haven't checked where the cable mounting points are. And my main issue with this is that there aren't that many cable anchor points in here for the Velcro to sit. And what MSI actually needed to do is kind of retool this case to have the anchor point here sit about an inch lower. There's plenty of room for it. They could have just extended the cable routing hole or something like that, or just lowered these points down, even just half an inch would have made all the difference. Because at the moment, once you lock that thing off, it completely covers the Type-C header down there. So bit of an oversight from MSI there, but it's not the end of the world. You can still use that, or you can just remove the cable anchor and just use the other ones. It's probably not going to make that much difference, but just thought I would mention that. However, the other thing I noticed is that there really isn't that much cable tidying going on here. Now, I know that we've got the connectors on the rear of the motherboard, but you still kind of need to anchor them in place and to prevent the side panel from kind of bulging or not being able to be installed, especially because there's not a lot of clearance between the motherboard tray and the side panels. So we're going to install a few cables now and see what we actually get, but not before I have a look and see just how these things are kind of laid out and what it looks like, because it's a pretty unique view from the rear of this case at the moment. So yeah, 24-pin ATX connector, you've got the SATA cables down here, so obviously super easy to route these through down to your case. Now, when it comes to the connectors, again, you're going to have to be pretty careful about which actual cables you use, because down here we can see these right angle cables. You might struggle to fit a right angle connector on there, which means you'll have to use the straight one, and that's going to have to bend at a pretty sharp angle down there. So be interesting to see in a minute, once we get some cable strapped in, what actually happens. So first of all, we've got the issue with the Type-C cable. I'm just going to dislodge this from all its cable ties down here so we can actually route it in properly. And that will then go into that slot. Then around behind me, I've got an extension cable for a 24-pin connector, so we're going to hook that in as well. And that is all you need to do. So it's so easy. I can't believe how easy it is to actually just connect everything on your motherboard. And I hate it when you just pass a cable through here and it knocks the rubber grommet off as well. That's one of my pet peeves with PC building, is just knocking those grommets off. But I kind of like them because they hide the cables better. So it's kind of a catch-22. So the 8-pin EPS 12 volt up there for your CPU. So that, again, that's going to be a lot easier to cable tidy in. We've got a couple of cable anchor points down here. The 24-pin connector is a little bit more difficult because it kind of wants to be anchored around here. Or maybe you could do it over that side. You do actually have some cable anchor points over here, but it's kind of going a long way from your power supply there. So it's still doable though. So I think that's probably going to be the easiest way around. But you can see here, this is kind of where the side panel sits. And if I just sort of swing it around, you can see that there's not going to be a lot of clearance between the side panel and that cable. So yeah, it's kind of up to you as to which way around you go. But I think the more you bend it, the more you sort of get to a right angle bending it that way, the easier it's going to be. Because if you start doing that, this thing's going to start bulging out. So kind of an interesting idea or interesting concept, and it's raising some interesting problems as well. It's not really that often that I have to worry about which way to bend the cables to get the side panel along, because there's just not a lot of flex in this cable when it sits so close to the motherboard tray. So I think what I'll do for now, because I want to do a proper video on how to do like a proper job here with this case and motherboard combo. So what I'm going to do now is just leave these two cables here and just see what happens when I try and close the side panel. And if I just kind of tuck that cable in down there, just see what happens when I try and plug the side panel back in again. So I'm just going to shove a load of cables down there. We've got the case here. So we do have some locking flanges on the bottom here. So it's not it's popping at the top, which is maybe a bit of a sketchy idea given how much pressure I think is going to be on this side panel. But yeah, we'll just have to wait and see. Bear in mind, I've not really done anything with those cables in there. They're just kind of sitting there. But it does kind of sit on fairly well. And I felt there was a fair bit of pressure from those cables there, and that's without tidying them. And the other good thing is that there's no bulge here whatsoever down the side of the case. So I'm actually much more optimistic than I was at the start of this arrangement working on this side of the case, just because of the clearance. I guess you've got probably like 3/4 of an inch or something, an inch at most, I think, to route these cables. But it does look like it's going to be a much easier task than I otherwise thought it would be. So other cables you've got to deal with, obviously the fan headers. You've got the option of connecting them down at the bottom, but I'm going to use these ones up here. So that's just as easy as that, just to plug in your fan cables. It's going to be super useful for reducing cable clutter from your fans as well, because you can, like these ones here, you don't have to route them back through to your motherboard or anything like that. And you've even got a hub down here as well from MSI to cater for those things if you need to. So other cables we've got, RGB cable we've got here for the included fans. So that one we'll just hook in up the top like so. And these things obviously not presenting any problems from a side panel point of view. It's just the main cables that you've got with these is just going to be the main issue. But there are a couple of anchor points, as I mentioned over here. You've got some as well, just to kind of tuck them out of the way. And if you've got an extension cable, that's probably even more useful, because then you can just hide everything else from your power supply in the bottom of the case. So a really interesting concept here from MSI. And as I mentioned, we'll be back with another video doing a proper job with the cable tidying and just seeing what we've got here. But so far, so good. Moving on to some performance numbers now then, and the VRM temperature of 41 degrees C was reached with a Ryzen 7 7800 X3D under full load. So even with a more powerful CPU in there running at full load, you're going to be well away from any danger temperatures. So probably to be expected, because the motherboard has some very large heat sinks and decent power circuitry. We installed two SSDs onto our motherboard. One was to house Windows and the other one was for our temperature testing, which was a WD SN850 PCI Express 4 SSD. This reached a peak temperature of 63 degrees in a looped test of Crystal Disk Mark running for 10 minutes, which is well away from any thermal temperatures, so you should be fine to run a couple of hot running SSDs on this motherboard. The audio performance probably won't be that much of a concern to your average user or gamer, but if you're an audiophile where audio quality is very important, you might want to use an external audio card or something like that, because the numbers here are fairly typical of a low-end Realtek audio codec. So what do we make of MSI's Project Zero combo then, which obviously includes the B650M Project Zero motherboard and the MAG Pano M100R Project Zero case? Well, I'm reliably told that the case will be available very soon, but I was also told from MSI that they have fixed one of the issues with that case, which is the USB connector, and the fact that because it's a straight connector and it's a straight case, straight cable that comes from the case, the cable bends around and has to contend with the side panel pressing on it, and that puts pressure onto the connector and the cable, which isn't ideal. So MSI has a fix for that in the form of an angled connector or adapter being included in the case to solve that problem, and that may actually solve the problem with the Velcro tie going right over the top of the port as well. So what I'm hoping is that the angled adapter means that the Velcro tie can actually now pass over it and thread itself through the second anchor point as normal. Starting with the motherboard, it's pretty high end for a B650 chipset motherboard. Plenty of features. You get 20 gigabits a second on the Type-C port as well, and that's full USB 3.2 Gen 2x2. So if you've got a really fast SSD, external SSD that is, for example, you'll get full speed through that port. You get USB BIOS flashback, you get a CMOS clear button, you get excellent VRM and M.2 temperatures as well, plus the board looks really awesome, I think, in my opinion. The case, obviously, you get lots of fans as standard. I think it looks absolutely great. The one thing we don't know is the price. So the motherboard retailing for around 230, 240 bucks. That's pretty reasonable for a socket AM4 motherboard that sports the B650 chipset. So it's good to know that actually implementing these rear-facing ports doesn't seem to cost that much more overall. Obviously, we do have slightly lackluster audio on this board, but that's just one of the compromises that has to be made. But hopefully the case isn't going to cost too much more than $100. I'm hopefully between 100 and 150, and that would mean that the overall package here, the combo, the Project Zero combo, won't cost much more than $350, $400, which is pretty reasonable for this exceptional feature. So I want to thank MSI for sending over this gear today. I absolutely love the Project Zero concept, and I love it so much I want to see it on lots more motherboards and cases in future if possible. MSI, and if other manufacturers are out there listening as well, you need to check this out because it's absolutely awesome. So thanks for MSI for sending over all the gear. Don't forget to comment below. Let me know what you think about Project Zero. Don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel as well. And we also have some very, very interesting videos coming very, very soon. And it involves some big news from NVIDIA. So don't forget to stay tuned to the channel and subscribe. And I will be back soon.